Well, Fritjof, your introductions are every bit as moving as your lectures, and I thank you very much for that. What I'd like to do this evening is really to discuss with you the rediscovery of the creativity of nature. This is really the new science of life and qualities that Fritjof has alluded to, and which has been very much the content of his course and the explorations by the participants in the course during the last 4 weeks. And this will lead into what is a new development here at Schumacher, which is in step with this celebration of the rediscovery of the creativity of nature. And I'll mention that towards the end. But let me start off with an attempt to locate what is happening now, because really we live in interesting times, and the developments that we are participating in are, I think, of quite extraordinary importance and significance. And it's sometimes useful to go back to see where we have come from, and that will help to illuminate the next step, although nobody knows where we're going except in a general sense, that we are moving out of modernity, the last 400 years, dominated by scientific thinking and the marketplace, and we are now moving into a new era, a postmodern era, which is causing immense confusion, but at the same time a lot of openings and excitement and possibilities. So what we're witnessing in the end of modernity is really the termination of this exploration of nature in terms of manipulation and control. The basic Galilean science or Newtonian science that Fritjof mentioned, the Newtonian framework of mechanism, looking at mechanisms, nature as a mechanism that we can control, the way we control clocks. That is coming to an end. It's coming to an end because after 400 years, we have explored those areas of nature where this paradigm actually works. And it does work. There's absolutely no doubt about it. It has its range of validity. But at the same time, it's extremely limited. I mean, it's perfectly good for light bulbs and cars and jets and other areas, but when it comes to living organisms and ecological systems, when it comes to economics, anything that has to do with human beings and life and the extension of this to Gaia, it is simply unable to provide what modernity expected, that is, knowledge that could be used for the manipulation and control of nature. There are plenty of scientists who believe that this enterprise will go on, and no doubt it will for many years, but it has now become quite dangerous. It's become dangerous in that if you believe you have control of nature, when in fact nature is slipping through your fingers all the time and is intrinsically creative and unpredictable in its responses to the perturbations that we introduce. And these can be quite large scale, as we know from global warming and so on. Then this naive view that we can control nature becomes very dangerous. So we have to move into this new way of doing science, which means a new way of relating to nature. And I want to go right back to, I'm going to go back before modernity began, before the 17th century, and look at the roots, first of all, of the Renaissance and the Renaissance Magi, because there's a sense in which we are now beginning to resonate with some of the themes that dominated during the Renaissance. And I'll go back actually to Iberia and to an extraordinary philosopher, mystic, called Ramon Lull and the Lullian art. Now, here is a picture of people practicing the Lullian art, if you can see it. I'll just go through it. It's not very clear, I'm afraid. What you have is a woman on a white horse, and she represents intelligence. There's hard work going on here. And here are four men representing a Gentile. I'm not sure if I have them in the right order, but they're a Gentile, a Jew, a Muslim, and a Christian. Because in Iberia, during the 13th and 14th centuries, all these religions were actually unified. They lived together in perfect harmony. Well, nothing's perfect, but nevertheless, reasonable harmony. And it was a very, very synthetic period. And then, of course, this unification was destroyed by the diaspora in 1492. But that diaspora actually was a great stimulus to the Renaissance. And ideas like Kabbalah and Hermetic philosophy and Neoplatonism and so on, they all emerged out of this ferment that had been going on in Iberia and then was disseminated by the diaspora of the Jews when they were chucked out of Spain. Now, we are witnessing something very similar to that today. It's the diaspora of Tibetan Buddhism, where China is taking over Tibet, as we all are painfully aware, essentially destroying the roots of Buddhism in Tibet. But there is this extraordinary diaspora. And I remember going up to London on the train with Stephen Batchelor a couple of years ago, and I felt so distressed about this situation. Stephen said, it may not be such a bad thing after all. And despite the pain and the destruction that's being caused in Tibet, there's a sense in which these movements, these diasporas, actually give rise to a new impulse. And the Buddhist impulse is one of the things that is now coming into the new science and the new way of living and the new way of participating with nature in the way that the diaspora in 1492 stimulated the emergence of the Renaissance. Now, I don't want to be naive about these causal relationships. I'm just pointing out some rather interesting historical similarities here. Now, Ramon Lull was one of the great influences on... this is from the work of Frances Yates, by the way, and this is from a book of hers called The Occult Philosophy in the Elizabethan Age. And so here you have this image of intellectual work, and you notice the trees are speaking. We have a cognitive biology here. This is Maturana and Varela already in the 14th century, speaking Catalan instead of, well, Latin, I guess, but Catalan was the lingua franca there, rather than Spanish. So what then happened? How did this Renaissance unity, in which there was a sense of... Shakespeare is filled with the image of harmony, celestial harmony, and the image of love making the world go round, attraction, repulsion. And I want to refer to a very interesting paper by an American historian of science called Stephen Goldman, and it's called From Love to Gravity. Renaissance nature philosophy versus modern science. And what he argues here is that the transition from seeing the world as a world of relationships and participation to one of mechanism was accompanied by the transformation from love to gravity. So instead of love making the world go round, suddenly it was gravity that made the world go round, so it all went into this gravitational field. Now, I'm going to come back to fields because that's something to conjure with, this notion of fields. Things don't disappear from cultures. They just get sort of squeezed into little boxes, like the genie in the bottle. It gets very dangerous. So when you take the top off, it comes out. But nevertheless, that's what we have to do. We've got to have to take off the top off this bottle. Now, I want to quote from Stephen Goldman. He says, "For me, the distinction of modern science from Renaissance nature philosophy lies primarily in its depersonalization of the pursuit and achievement of knowledge." What does this mean? In modern science, the qualities of the seeker after knowledge are at best irrelevant and more generally a serious obstacle to achieving knowledge. In Renaissance nature philosophy, just the opposite was the case. To achieve knowledge of nature required perfection of one's physical, moral, and spiritual, no less than intellectual characteristics. This was because for Renaissance nature philosophers, all of reality was a single, coordinated domain, every region of which was intrinsically related to every other region, so that to know the region called nature entailed knowing the whole sphere of being within which nature was embedded. So that's a wonderfully holistic synthetic view, and it's what we're struggling to bring back now. I want to just move to another quotation towards the end of this paper, in which, in the paper, Goldman discusses the influence of Francis Bacon on this transition. Bacon, who set up the Royal Society. Bacon, who was the one who defined knowledge as being in the service of the control and manipulation of nature for the benefit of man. So this alienation of humanity from nature and the use of knowledge for technology, effectively. And Goldman, the author, says that there is a problem in putting knowledge together with technology, and he says that Bacon himself seems to have foreseen this problem, for which he is in some non-trivial sense responsible. And this comes out in the interpretation of a Greek myth, Hephaestus' attempted rape of Athene. Hephaestus, god of the forge, and therefore a symbol of technological power, wanted to make love to Athene, the goddess of wisdom. But she disdained any sexual union, being committed to virginity. One day, duped by Poseidon, Hephaestus believed that Athene was coming to his smithy to satisfy his desire, and when she arrived, he embraced her. She pulled away, and Hephaestus' sperm fell onto the ground, from which a child sprang up that was human from the waist up and serpent-like from the waist down. Moral? Asks Goldman. The offspring of technology attempting to force itself onto wisdom is monstrous. So the great Moravian dictator Comenius, who bridged the decades between Bacon's death and the founding of the Royal Society in London in 1663, put it in this way: unless the new philosophy makes values an intrinsic component of nature study, it is as likely to construct a hell as a heaven on earth. So these are other prophetic elements that are always present in myths. The Faustus story, Marlowe's Faustus rather than Goethe's, in which there is no salvation, there's no a chance at retribution. And then Mary Shelley's Frankenstein story, which are recognitions of this danger in the misuse of knowledge and the assumption that we have it for control rather than wisdom. Now, this is a very difficult passage to go through, not to totally abandon technology, but to relinquish the mental idea that knowledge is for control and manipulation of nature, and to adopt the view of wisdom, which is that we are participants in this creative dance, and that we can influence nature for good or ill, And it's up to us to decide how we're going to do it. But we can no longer control and manipulate. Now, how has science come to this? Because this seems a very hard lesson for science, for modern science to learn. And it's to some extent the sciences of complexity that have taken us there. The story of chaos, which really begins at the end of the 19th century, with a study of planetary motion, looking at gravitational attraction between three bodies, and realizing, as Poincaré did, that there's something wild and uncontrollable about nature. The moment you begin to go a little bit more complex than two bodies. But of course it wasn't until the 1960s and 1970s that the full impact of this realization that natural processes are intrinsically chaotic. And remember that chaos is not randomness. Chaos has a deep intelligibility about it. It is deterministic. It's governed by mathematical law. So here we have this extraordinary situation of a mathematical process that is nevertheless unpredictable for particular reasons that I don't want to go into now, because some of you know this territory very well. But they're essentially because of limitations with respect to observation. We can never make perfect observations, for example, on the weather. This is why we can only make a limited prediction as to what's going to happen in the future. If we had perfect information and we could calculate perfectly, okay, we could do it in principle. But that is just impossible. And therefore the weather is uncontrollable. And now it's being realized that, it's unpredictable and uncontrollable. And now we realize that more and more of nature is like that. So there's a very limited domain of nature that obeys principles of cause and effect that give rise to the possibility of control. So being a scientist, I'm going to tell you a little story now, a little scientific story, and watch the way this story goes, because it's really quite interesting. It's about how we try to understand emergent, what are now called emergent phenomena. That is, processes which are unpredictable from a knowledge of the components that give rise to the phenomenon. And we see what science makes of this, because it's illuminating, and at the same time it points us in a certain direction for further development. Just the simplest example I could give you of this emergent phenomena would be, take the example of hydrogen and oxygen coming together to make water. Now, hydrogen and oxygen can be perfectly well understood in themselves as gases with particular well-defined properties, and even a quantum mechanical theory of the hydrogen atom. But nobody has been able to predict why, when you bring the two together and make H2O, you get the properties that are familiar to us in water. Now, this is what I mean by an emergent phenomenon. And science acknowledges that what it then does is to create theories that focus on consistency between levels. But that consistency is not equivalent to reducing water to hydrogen and oxygen. There is no reduction that is achieved here. And in many aspects of science, this is the case. And I'm going to give you a little example from biology, because whereas physicists have known about, physicists sort of became wise little by little, and then all of a sudden with quantum mechanics. But biologists, as Fritjof has pointed out, biologists are still, in a sense, they're still in the dark ages. They still believe in the Laplacian demon. They believe that if you manipulate genes, you can control organisms. And that's what we see in genetic engineering. Very dangerous science there. So, the story I'm going to tell is about ants, social insects, to generalize to social insects. But we're all, I think, well aware of the extraordinary capacities of these little organisms to engage in collective and cooperative behavior. And I've got a few slides just to evoke a few images. Here are the army ants marching across the floor of the tropical rainforest, doing a wonderful job ecologically, tidying things up, tilling the soil when they make their nests, their underground chambers and so on, and generally recycling all those aspects of nature with which they come into contact. And they have this amazing collective organization. I remember in Malaysia once coming across a trail of army ants going across a path. And we had to find a way of getting across this trail of army ants because these were quite large and we didn't want to be attacked. So we leapt over them and then we walked on down and about half a kilometer or a kilometer further on, we crossed them again. We thought, my goodness, this is a long trail. That happened again and again. So that as we went down the trail, we kept crossing this trail of army ants. I mean, it just blew my mind. So many ants, and all organized collectively. So we also have examples, of course, of the leaf cutter ant that goes around harvesting leaves from a particular tree and taking them into the chambers underground and growing a fungus on the leaves. The fungus depends upon the ants, because the ants mulch the fungus and prepare it. They mulch the leaves and prepare it for the fungus. And then, of course, they eat the product, the fungal product. So this is a beautifully symbiotic relationship. Highly organized, they're excellent gardeners. And so that's just another example of this cooperative organization. And of course, in their nests, they engage in looking after the brood. Here are the young, the larvae, and the ants move them around from one chamber to another, depending upon time of day, to keep them at relatively constant temperature. And of course, they feed them and tidy up after them after they've hatched, and they look after the queen. So all this cooperative activity going on in the nest, and it's possible to study particular species in the laboratory. It's not very convenient to study army ants in the laboratory, so you choose a species of small ants that are quite happy to make their nests in small crevices. And in the lab you can arrange things so that they make their brood chamber in between two pieces of plastic that are held apart by blue tack by a couple of millimeters. These are small ants. They're 2 or 3 millimeters in size. And then under those circumstances, you can study them in great detail because they don't see very well. They don't care whether the lights are on or off. They get on with their job in the dark or the light. And so you can examine them. And it was a detailed examination of the behavior of individual ants by somebody working in Texas, Blaine Cole, in Houston, that revealed that when the ants are on their own, they have a pattern of activity and inactivity which is chaotic. They're active for a certain period of time, then they go inactive, they go active, inactive, and there is no predictability whatsoever to this pattern of activity, inactivity. But if there are enough ants in a particular domain, in a particular space, so the density is high enough, suddenly there is a rhythmic activity pattern that emerges. So all the ants are active together, or most of them, not all of them, most of them, and then they're inactive. So here is an example of chaotic individuals interacting to produce an ordered behavior pattern, a rhythmic activity pattern. Now, in the brood chamber, you can actually see this activity pattern. I'm referring now to the work of Nigel Franks at the University of Bath, just up the road. Give these ants little grains of sand, and they define a boundary for the brood chamber. And within the brood chamber, there's a queen, and there are the young, the larvae, and then the worker ants. They're all females. They look after the brood. Is it warm in here? Shall I? I feel warm. Shall I open this door? There we are. And so these ants can then be observed under these circumstances, and they have this rhythm of activity. So here we have a question. How does rhythmic order come out of the behavior of chaotic individuals? Because here's an emergent property, just like hydrogen and oxygen making water. You can study individual ants to your heart's content. You would never be able to predict that in a group, collectively interacting, they produce rhythmic behavior. So how do scientists go about explaining or attempting to understand this process? And what you do as a scientist is, having made the observations, and as many observations as you need, in order to construct a model of the behavior of these ants, you can then go about defining what you believe to be the pattern of interactions of a group of virtual ants, and then see if the behavior of the model matches the behavior of the ant colony. Now, I mention this because 2 weeks ago there was an article in the New Scientist on this, covering this territory, that I wrote in conjunction with one of the editors, who gave me a lot of help, I must say, in clarifying the argument. But this is something that I did with a couple of colleagues, somebody from the University of Mexico and the other from University in Barcelona, a Catalan. So same culture as Ramon Llull. And we constructed a model in which we explored the behavior of virtual ants, that is, computer ants, that obeyed certain very simple rules of interaction, moved around on a grid the way these ants do. As individuals, they moved chaotically. So our virtual ants had chaotic motion when they were in isolation. And we wanted to know what happens when they interact with each other, given that, and here's the crucial aspect of interaction, if there's an inactive ant sitting here and an active ant comes up to it and touches it or interacts with it, this inactive ant is activated. So there's a transmission of activity, there's a stimulation of activity throughout the colony. And the question is that enough to produce a rhythm? Just that simple bit of sociality, that interaction between ants. And it turned out that it was. That's all we needed. So within a confined domain, with mathematical functions describing how ants interact, and of course ants could have more than one neighbor, they could have several neighbors, and then you have to define precisely how this interaction takes place. And from that very simple model, what emerges is the phenomenon that you see in nature. Now, this doesn't prove that this is how the ants are doing it. It simply says, here is a consistent description. We're not reducing one level of organization, the level of cooperative activity, this rhythmic activity pattern in which ants are actively tending the brood and the queen, and then they're taking a rest. And they're getting back to, and they do this about once every 25 minutes, this cycle. So 15 minutes activity, 10 minutes of rest. So tea break twice an hour. It's not bad. And so this type of collective organization can then be understood in terms of this really very, very simple interaction pattern. Now, notice what has happened. First of all, we acknowledge that this is an unpredictable phenomenon. We had to see it before we could anticipate that it would occur. Having seen it, we could then ask, how does it happen? Then we could build a model. But in the process of building a model, what have we done? We've actually pretty well cut ourselves off from the ants. We are the observers. We're looking at these ants and we're modeling them as automata, as little mechanisms. So this is science as usual in one respect. That is, it's still this depersonalization of nature. The scientist is not undergoing any process of transformation, purification, not engaging in any kind of meditative interaction with the ants. None of that. Just observation. Strict observation of laboratory ants and then constructing a model. But there is this one crucial difference, and that is the recognition that this, in some sense, expresses what we're seeing is this creativity of nature, which we cannot predict, and therefore we cannot control. Because we cannot say, right, we're now going to make all the ants active at a particular time and inactive at another time. They do it themselves and under circumstances that are under their control, because they actually regulate the density of the colony. And they regulate the density of the colony to a point where they have this collective rhythm emerging, and the collective rhythm seems to be useful for tending the brood, because you get a better distribution of care. The caregivers distribute their activity over the brood. And this is an interpretation of why it is that this pattern of activity is useful to the ants. Okay, that's just a little scientific story to illustrate how people go about, how scientists go about attempting to understand emergent phenomena. But there is still this gap between understanding the part and understanding the whole. Where does that whole come from? That whole collective activity pattern. In some sense, we have smuggled it in through the mathematical descriptors that we use. And what we're describing mathematically are fields of interaction. That is, how ants interact in space and how that affects their behavior in time. Those are fields. That's what fields are all about. So that leaves us with the question, really, how are we to proceed in a world in which we recognize these emergent creativities? We're not in a position of control, and we have to take now a further step in order to enter into some kind of sensitive participation, I don't say with the ant colony as a colony, but certainly with the ants in the context of their ecosystem, to recognize what they're doing, how we should respect them and recognize their intrinsic value. They are part of the same creativity. They manifest the same creativity that we value so much in ourselves. Now let me just go back to something written which has an interesting take on this whole issue of fields. in science. It's a dialogue between Rupert Sheldrake and Matthew Fox, and it's called Natural Grace. Some of you will know this book. And I remember a few years ago I had a discussion with Rupert about this relationship between fields and souls, because if we go back to this story about From Love to Gravity, you remember love, an aspect of the soul, was turned into the gravitational field. So that's where that's been pushed. Now, Rupert uses the concept of field in a very different way than I do, but it has certain things in common. For Rupert, fields are fields of relationships. But for Rupert, there is no energy involved in the field of morphic resonance. No energy. So Rupert is a dualist. He believes the world is divided into influences that are energetic and material and those which are not. Now, I happen to be a monist, so I reject that interpretation, but otherwise, it's the same dialogue about fields. And this is what, this is Rupert. The idea that nature is inanimate has been replaced by the idea of nature being organized by fields. Fields, like souls, are invisible organizing principles. In the ancient Greek period, and right up until the 17th century, magnets were thought to have souls. The soul was the invisible thing in and around the magnet, responsible for its attractive and repulsive powers. Today, we think of magnets as having fields. In area after area of science, the old idea of the soul as an invisible organizing principle has been replaced by the concept of a field. So I would say that nature is being reanimated through fields, which have taken on many of the traditional roles of souls in the pre-mechanistic paradigm. Interesting take on fields. Now, here is Matthew Fox's response. He says, "I really love your writing about the fields and the soul, about the fields and the soul as field. This is a profound contribution because the question of what soul means is a very critical question. We have lost the meaning of soul in the West. It's been trivialized. It's the pineal gland, then the cerebral cortex. It's just so puny. Who really cares?" Charles Fair, the philosopher of history, says that when a civilization loses its meaning of soul, it breaks apart as a civilization. Soul is a most important concept. It gives meaning to this essence of civilization. When a civilization loses its meaning of soul, it's the end of an era. The good news is we're at the beginning of a new era if we can come up with some new images for soul. So in a sense, I see this as part of the process that we're engaged in. Trying to rediscover participation, relationships that went into fields and recover them as something that has direct and immediate experiential quality about it, so that we can start to relate to nature in ways that, in fact, everybody still does, but they're denied by science. Galilean science functions only in terms of primary qualities, that is, measurable quantities. Those aspects of the world that are measurable, that you can put a number to. And the secondary qualities, the taste, the color, the texture, the beauty, the aesthetic values, and ethics, these have no place in modern science. But without them, we're lost. So this little dialogue on the soul, and I'm not advocating the use of the term soul particularly. I'm just saying that in some sense we have to recover the meaning in terms of relationships and participation. Now there's one other thing that Matthew Fox says that I find extremely interesting. And that has to do with the concept of spirit. He says this: spirit is a wild river, a raging fire, a great eagle, a great goose. Spirit is something very wild, and we can get ourselves prepared for it and to receive it. And that, of course, resonates with David Abram's view of the animistic aspect of nature. Nature watches you as you watch it. And that this whole notion of chaos is a kind of wildness, it cannot be suppressed. It's a playfulness and a wildness in nature that mathematics is discovering, or has discovered, and we are now discovering its manifestation in living organisms in many, many different respects. We find that health, your heart, the healthy heart has a kind of wildness about it. It has a chaotic component to it. Too much order is bad for you. This is already diagnostic of danger in terms of the study of electrocardiograms. Physiological variables have this wildness, this kind of chaos, this uncontrollable expression of diversity. And so the science that is beginning to emerge, the new science, is one in which we're rediscovering the sources of this creativity, and we're beginning to move in a direction of participation. Now, the last question I want to touch on is, all right, we've looked at ants, but what does this tell us, if anything, about human relationships, human organizations, which is, after all, what we want to discover how to reorganize in ways that produce more satisfactory, more creative, more innovative, more adaptable behavior than the rather stereotypical responses that have become part and parcel of our culture. The big technological fix, genetic engineering to solve the world's food supply problems. And what is emerging very strongly is that the patterns of interaction in human communities that are rather like the interaction patterns, they're the analogues, I shouldn't say they're the analogues of the interaction patterns in ant colonies, are in fact conversations. This is what emerged today, over the weekend, last week. Participants in Fritjof's course have been talking about this, exploring this territory. The role of conversation and the quality of conversation in different groups, in different organizations, under different circumstances. And so the science of qualities, as I've called it, which is a science that addresses all the qualities that were left out of Galilean science, all the so-called secondary qualities. That is now animating this whole area. In other words, there's a feed forward from complexity and chaos into the study of human relations, and a feed back to complexity from the study of human organizations, saying we have to relate to nature and each other in a totally new way. We have to get beyond the dualities, and we have to enter this new world of participation. Now, this is what we are attempting to do in the MSc in Holistic Science here at Schumacher, which starts this September. it has as its foundation both the study of analytical science, the science of quantities, but the new science of complexity, which opens a window onto a world of participation because it's a world that we can no longer control, and therefore we have to walk very carefully in that world like a good therapist in relation to somebody that is undergoing healing. So that is, as I say, a part of the Holistic Science Master's course is to stress complexity, the new science, emergent properties, the non-reductionism from one level to another, the fact that each level of organization, hydrogen, oxygen, water, the ant colony as a superorganism, ecological systems, human organizations, and so on, each has an irreducible level of emergent order. They need to be understood, they need to be acknowledged, and they need to be participated in, not just observed and classified. So that this long-term distinction between facts and values, which is the basis of positivism in science, and allows the scientist to remove himself or herself from positions of responsibility with respect to the knowledge that is generated, that all has to be transformed in such a way that we get responsible participation. So just to come back to this adventure that we're involved in, this transformation, let me reiterate that we really are at the end of an era, and that Schumacher College, I think, is attempting to not simply recognize the problems that we face, but do something about them. And the Holistic Science Master's course is an attempt to introduce perhaps a more relevant type of scientific analysis together with experiential relationship with nature, which is very possible in an environment of this kind. So, thank you very much.
When the ants were doing their activity, did they sort of take it in shifts, or did they all still at the same time complete the larvae and their duties, or were they were some of them still active while the others were not?
Well, they tended to be to all be active at the same time, and then inactive. But while most of them were active, some of them were resting, and while some of them were resting, some were active, or at least while most of them were resting, some were active. So there is no, there's a kind of paradox here of maximum individual freedom and maximum collective order simultaneously by having this sort of combination of chaos and order. That is, the order that emerges out of chaos is not a mechanical order. It's a very free kind of order, and it can dissolve away when the density changes. But it's very effective. It gets the job done, and at the same time, as I say, there's freedom for the individual to do something else. Friends who look at how diversity arises during the speciation and extinction during evolution. And again, what they do is they describe it as a self-organized critical phenomenon. In other words, it has the characteristics of fractal structure and chaos, which emerges from a very simple dynamic. It is not Darwinian. It's not that we get evolution through Darwinian mechanisms of competition and selection. And it's not that the species that go extinct are the ones that fail to adapt. That is just not the dynamics of evolution. I mean, I'm being very categorical here. You can see what I believe, but the other side has its arguments as well. But what I'm saying is that I believe in modeling, and I believe in looking at the consequence, just the way you do with the ants, trying to understand these processes. But I think that we have to always be very careful about what we're leaving out, what we're putting in that's cryptic, that's hidden in relation to parts and wholes, and what we're actually leaving out, which is participation. the active participation and the respect for the organisms. And without that, we're in trouble.
Society. Do you think human society, if they didn't have so much control from outside, communities could be more self-regulating without so much control from government and authorities and rules and regulations? Do you think communities could develop so that they could be more cooperative and live with each other?
Yes, I like Chomsky's phrase, libertarian anarchy. You know?
Yes.
I mean, it terrifies people. You say, oh my goodness, from anarchy nothing good can come. But I think that's precisely what gives rise to emergent order.
Yes.
Now, the thing is, we're always going to have structures at different levels, and it's going to be experienced as interference, one level interacting with another. But it's a matter of having these networks, and this is what we were talking about this morning, networks organized in such a way that the dynamics can flow freely, so the individuals are not coerced into particular forms of activity, but their freedom is acknowledged and their creativity is acknowledged and given the opportunity to result in leadership and facilitation and all the aspects that can emerge from cooperative groups. And certainly I think we're in for a very big shift with the disappearance of the nation state, which is what we're seeing in front of our eyes. Governments are just capitulating to the World Trade Organization and its laws, the higher levels of directives. That's going to provoke, that's part of a process that's going to provoke a reaction that will go much more local to, well, different people have different theories as to what will emerge, but certainly local economies, local buying and selling, including micro-investment and participation to some extent in global activity, but activities which are immune from the restrictions of WTO and GATT. It will survive as the dynamic local community, trading and productivity and maintaining quality of life for communities. So these are all emergent forms that I think we're seeing these transitions happening right now. It's a bit frustrating, but I mean, locally there are very strong movements. We haven't got the network organization in place yet, but I think it's coming.
Well, if I may make a comment, it's extraordinary to me that this kind of approach to science now also comes much closer to art. Even artists who are very, even sort of mechanical almost. Many years ago, I remember I heard a lecture by Stockhausen, the German composer who composed some 8-tonal piece of music with a mathematical formula. And he said, well, I went on, and then at a certain point, I didn't like it, so I just composed. So, there's this mystery in art.
Yes, yeah. Yes, no, I think that's true. And yet, I mean, as you're well aware, all scientists acknowledge this, the role of intuition as an aspect. It's the intuitive faculty that gives rise to making sense of the parts in a theory or in any insight into how things are organized as wholes. And so this is certainly a part of scientific activity, but it's not cultivated. And I think the point you make is very important, because the arts are where you cultivate the intuition. And that needs to be brought into science, so the division between art and science begins to disappear. Now that makes me wonder if the term science of qualities is actually the right kind of term. Should we continue to use the term science at all? No, science. If we're talking about... well, I'm saying maybe we can't get away from the overtones of modernity in science. Science will always be seen to be something that is concerned with manipulation and control.
So that's what I'm saying. Would it not be better to think in terms of art instead of science?
Maybe, or something else. Yes. But, I mean, we're calling it holistic science as a first step. But I hope that that will evolve into something that does embrace the arts and the sciences, and is a an educational process in which the intuition is cultivated, everybody's actively and joyfully.
Approach to science.
A holistic approach to science could
Artistic.
be artistic.
Approach
Artistic.
to science.
Sure. Well, I think we're in the market for ideas here. So, whatever you'd like to suggest, put them in the box with your contribution. That would be great.
You attack reductionists and poor old Galileo but weren't they amazing geniuses that actually unified? I mean, they weren't dealing with small parts. They discovered fundamental general laws that applied to every single thing. I was wondering, that didn't seem too reductionist to me.
Well, that's right. It's very difficult to produce a critique while simultaneously acknowledging the incredible genius inside. I should say the last 400 years have been no trivial journey. We have learned a fantastic amount from this, and I am the last one who want to abandon it. So I regard analytical science as a fantastic tool and of understanding and trying to strip away those aspects of nature which, in a sense, hide the mysteries and come face to face with the mysteries that are there and are ineffable, like gravitation. It's one thing to describe it, but my goodness, the mystery remains. You don't remove that by the description of the mathematical laws according to which it apparently obeys. No. And I would want to acknowledge the genius of all the people who've contributed to this adventure of modernity. But it's simply necessary to recognize, I think, that things are changing. We need to preserve it. I want to preserve it. The thing I want to preserve more than anything in the spirit of science is its openness, its democratic nature. I think this was the primary genius of science. The scientific community was to have a common knowledge shared by everybody, and agreement by consensus. There is no truth in science without consensus. So this is, objectivity comes from consensus between subjects. That's where it comes from. It's not given. Although the positivists will like to say, you just open your eyes and you can see, the truth. Well, that's not true. So this is, I think, the great valuable contribution of science is its democratic, open, consensual, shared nature. People participate in this process. And that is what is under threat now by this union of science with the corporate sector, where the commons is now being enclosed by patenting. Now that, it seems to me, is a destruction of the soul of science. The actual essence of the creativity of the scientific enterprise is now being threatened by that process of, and you notice that quote from Francis Bacon, that Bacon already anticipated that danger. You put wisdom and technology together, and I'm not knocking technology, but I'm saying that if you lose the openness, the commons, if the commons gets enclosed, then you've lost the soul of science. And so there was something pathological. Every movement has its pathological element because it has to, I shouldn't say pathological, it has its lifetime. It's not pathology. It's got its lifetime. And it's got to die so something else can be born. But that's not to deny the incredible creativity that went into this 400 years of exploring nature from a point of view that had never been explored before. So yes, thank you, Joe. I want to acknowledge the value of science, particularly in its democratic nature.
You cited that idea from Rupert Sheldrake about how that objects were considered to have a kind of a soul, and then fields
have souls. Well, when you say intangible, I think electric field is a pretty tangible entity, and a magnetic field, and a gravitational field, and hydrodynamic field. These are all embodied aspects of force, process, dynamics. They make the world go round. These are the origins, these mysterious things that are the relationships, the essence of relationships.
But the fields that enable, let's say, the ant colonies to work together, or the morphic field, the field that you get in a sort of place of pilgrimage, the Rupert Sheldrake's ideas. I mean, they aren't actually ones that are agreed on by scientists.
Well, the ant field is. That's not a problem, because that is a tactile field. It's a field of touch and smell. So it's real. And this is why I was to some extent distancing myself from Rupert, not because I'm denying that Rupert may well be right in certain territories. I'm just saying that I would not want to, I don't think it's necessary to use the term morphic field for understanding ants, or for morphogenesis, for how we develop from an egg into the form we have. Now, there are other territories that Rupert is superb at exploring and eliciting experimental work on, like the relationship between owners and their pets. That some kind of parapsychological entity may well exist. I mean, I'm not denying that at all. But what I think is, what is emphasized in a participatory science is relationships. It's not things, it's relationships. And the whole is no thing. It's nothing. And it's what Henry Bortoft calls the active absence. You don't see it, but it actually has an embodiment, and so that it's present in terms of touch, smell, and these other forces. But it is distributed. You can't bottle it. You can't market it. But it's real. And it's what drives the creativity of nature, whatever it may be. It's a mystery. I mean, let's just be frank and acknowledge that these things are ultimately ineffable.
Well, maybe this is a good time to close.
Have some chai.
So,
yes.
Tea and cakes, to which you're all invited. Thank you very much again, Brian.
Okay. Thank you, Christopher.
Peace out.